follow. This will be part 13 in, sorry, part 14 in the series, but a direct follow-on from part 13 where I listed well, several sites that are at 98 feet being one of the defining measures. And so we saw Casado in Karnak, sorry, the great the fallen men here, and then we followed it through to the uh, England and around that part of the world, Avebury moving up into eventually coming to Scotland as well in Wasbister Barrow, just a bit slow. And so we saw, well, okay, skip on, so we had like Castlereagh Stones, Wasbister Barrow. It's evidence of it also in the Americas, North America, in Canada, but also we'll find it in these pyramids, these very important stone measurements. Even this pyramid now, I did point out in previous part, we can't be exactly sure of the measures, but given the corresponding, how in the existing places we do find it, even the stone circle in Brazil, all these things astronomically aligned, astronomical connections, the legends and the stories connected with all these apparently separate cultures being very similar, especially in regards to the flood and the dove being associated with that flood, just like Noah releases a dove in the biblical story, but also earlier Epic of Gilgamesh. He also released a raven, a swallow and a dove, as where Noah just released a raven and a dove. But we have these corresponding elements which were also, they describe measurement and the importance of it. We find gods of measurement, gods of knowledge, such as Thoth and Hermes, all these very similar descriptions being connected to the gift of language and all these things, and just blending into one another. And of course, cross time, cross cultures, and even several examples there in the earlier period, that sort of the old Egypt, towards the period where Karnak and Hatshepsut, and even to the later Temple of Dendar, which was a Roman building, but the Romans, of course, being very much into Isis, and we'll find it, of course, even in Trajan's column. Now, that one, again, I mentioned, is a bit of a question mark over the exact height of that, not to include the fact that they added the Christian sculpture at the top. But that is this recurring throughout the whole, all the videos I do in regards to modern architecture, ancient legends. We see that like Hermes and Thoth being gods of science, of measurement, of trade, of basically what we would call science, and being incorporated into those parts, and this, how it's even sort of been passed on, hidden in plain sight. A lot of stuff gets attached to these, and they're missing the more tangible elements of it, but gods of trade, gods of weights and measure, etc. And so what we saw was among, again, these same, like 82 feet, 98 feet, being incorporated so often, including in the same structures. Now, for instance, Kailasa Ellora Caves is 98 feet, but 164 feet long. 164 divided by 2 is 82 feet. And we see those examples, how these, even when it doesn't directly appear connected, well, it is. It's measurable. Now, even other temples, 41 feet and then 20.5 feet, across the world, cross time, and this very important in regards to, especially to astronomy and the sun, earth, moon, and the stars. Now, so 98 feet. There we have a breakdown of the units, which would, because, feet, cubits, hand, palm, inches, fingers, grains, etc. Like, for instance, grains being the basis of that, 3 grains being 1 inch. This is a standard practice going back some time. But grains are also used to define weights as well. So we have weights and measures intertwined with one another. They come to, including time being incorporated into that as well, and how all these systems harmonize together, especially in what we would now call the Quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. So what we've seen was 98 feet. Now, again, a recurring throughout this series and earlier ones, I've shown how the Salamis stone, as well as the capstone at the Red Pyramid, and I've pointed to some other places where we have these stone actually incorporates multiple units of measure, but this would set out the temple plan and the units of measure to be used in those temple, creating not only perfect proportions, but also incorporating very sacred numbers that are repeated throughout the legends and the stories of all these apparently separate non-connected cultures who are apparently using separate non-connected units of weights and measure when they are. We catalogue that, lots and lots of evidence for it. Again, it just goes against the narrative. But for instance, the Salamis stone, Doric and Ionic, as well as the so-called modern English foot, at least 2,500 years ago, 500 BC. And I would like to even extend this and to say, well, there's some evidence from this, we'll basically reverse engineering it to show that it actually either goes back much further or was derived from older units of measurement. And for instance, the cubit and the meter connection, I've touched on that, we'll touch on it again here. I've done some extensive videos on that, how important it is. Pardon. But also, so we still have Doric and Ionic and Corinthian being a very important feature in Freemasonry. For instance, this is a relatively modern tracing board, but we see older art forms incorporating the same information going back previous to the official modern lodges that we know now. So, as an example, that's a Doric column. These are the three Greek schools of architecture. We have the Ionic column, and we have the Corinthian column. So a very basic column, very simple capital. Here we have the swirls, which is representation of a woman, and then we have here the very elaborate Corinthian column with your canthus leaves connected to the maiden or the virgin. Here's an example. Now they're also connected to the senses, and that's something mentioned earlier, but if you're interested in investigating it, there's some strong connections there. Okay, so we do have the Doric and the Ionic schools of architecture. We also, Mark Wilson-Jones, he's done some brilliant work on that. I can't credit him enough in terms of what he's exposed here, and the basis of my work comes from the Salamis stone especially. Now, it's also important to remember that Dorian and Ionian are also musical modes. So we have systems of measurement, but we also have systems of music. And this will, again, a very important feature of this, because especially for the Quadrivium, it's about unifying apparent different fields into one basic form. And that's the beauty of it. That's why it's so important. That's why it's not taught to the plebs, so to speak, and has always been something hidden. And well, there's also reasons it's hidden because, well, there are other reasons. That's a long rant in there, so we'll just move on. So we have systems of measurement, we have systems of architecture, and we also have systems of music described by Doric and Ionic. Now, how do they connect? And so we do have the Doric and we do have the Ionic, but what are the Corinthian as a unit of measure? Well, firstly, by using the Salamis stone, we see here that 98 feet, as in all these ancient structures, also creates like a whole number, a lovely point of conversion of measurement. So, for instance, if we're working off 98 feet, whether you're working off the so-called modern English foot, the Doric or the Ionic, you have a whole number unit of measure where you can base these on. And I'll follow this up in some other episodes because it's okay, anyway, I'll leave that for future episodes because I'm going to go into this more and how this connects. But so what of the Corinthian? Well, I did a series, and I'll put the link in the description, the Parthenon series, and where I'm pointed out that based on the study of, for instance, the temple of Olympian Zeus, the first true Corinthian temple, what we have is that the Cremona foot, which is a ratio of 6 to 7 English feet, is the Corinthian, because we have the Corinthian columns in these temples. And also, okay, just pause a moment. Okay, so again, sorry, the link will be in the description. That the Cremona foot is the Corinthian because of, well, the reasons that I've laid out in this earlier series in regards to the Parthenon, and we'll touch on that in a moment again. Now, so now we have the Cremona scale, which is, so 7 feet equals 6 Cremona. 6 Cremona feet, 7 English feet. But we also have, well, this also appears in ancient times as well. In the Egyptian royal cubit, such as that used in the Great Pyramid, which in itself defines a 1 meter pendulum, 86,400 seconds per day, and a lot of other lovely information. But the New Kingdom cubit was at a ratio of 6 to 7, and this is something you'll see, you'll find appearing elsewhere, and I'm going to present some more information on this in not necessarily this series, but in future videos, been into ancient units of weights and measure, temples and comparisons, and it's just a extraordinary symphony of coincidence. So now we have these units, the Cremona, which I'd prefer to call the Corinthian, but it's now the Cremona up until 1850s was mentioned in a lot of university entrance exams, encyclopedias, merchant guidebooks, and it's just sort of, essentially disappeared off the face of the earth since that time for reasons I can't explain. But however, these numbers in themselves, again, will point to very important, like, part of this legacy. So for instance, 112 chakras in the human body, so in regards to yoga, the Vesica being one of these, well, 265 minus 153 is 112, so that's the best whole number approximation of the square root of 3. 112 pounds, the imperial hundredweight, and these labyrinths, which are around the world, but especially famous in Chartres, 112 cogs around there. It's also worth noting the famous alchemist Geber wrote 112 books, and there's a connection to 112 elements as well into that period of alchemy. Now we also have at 1008, well, there are 10,080 minutes per week, and, well, the pyramid is 1008 span, Rosicrucian tradition 144 octaves or 1008 notes, and again, just like the chakras, we have 1008, 1008 being an important feature in Eastern tradition as well. And so we have, ancient temples, ancient traditions, more modern esoterics, as well as combining time and music as well. So this is another example of the music being brought into this pattern. It's also worth noting that the diameter of the Earth plus the diameter of the Moon gives us this particular number as well. Nice little tie-in. I'll put the link in the description. International Standard. It's devoted to the discussion and dissemination of the wisdom contained in the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt. It was a series of magazines, especially about the origins of weights and measures as well, and it's just how these connect. Also, how through legends. So even in biblical legends, for instance, like, I'm not putting my stamp here, but just worth noting how they talk about 1008 and 336, which is an important feature, which is just like 1008 is to be found in the measures of the Great Pyramid itself. Now, for instance, the Great Pyramid, 280 Egyptian royal cubits, which comes from the second, which comes from the meter, above ground, but at a 5 to 6 ratio to the below ground portion, we have 336 Egyptian royal cubits. You could say that is its total height, including the invisible portion. And what else? Well, again, 252, 1008, even 3024 palms would correlate at 756. Has a very, very close average, not an exact number, but still worth mentioning, because it actually, if you look at it in 3-dimensional and you add two sides together, you'll actually get much, much closer to 756. No one side of a pyramid is exactly 756 feet. However, the Cremona, so in the chain, so that one chain is 66 feet, and posed this in earlier episodes how that's important as well. Such as that's 6633 over 2, the importance of that unit and that number as well. but at 1.272727 Cremona chain, it's describing the proportions of the Great Pyramid at its ideal, which is 440 cubits base, 280 cubits high, which again is a lovely little pointer to the size of the Earth and the Moon. And just as a, what you find is that this type of little symphonies, harmonies comes in together, pointing to some very the ancients were much clever than what we give them credit for, but 252 feet. So I've often in previous videos mentioned that it was Eratosthenes who described the Earth as being 252,000 stadia, polar circumference. That was wrong. It was Pliny and Strabo who did that, but contemporaries, but just to point out that they described it as 252,000 stadia. And depending on what stadia you use, it's essentially 99% to 100% correct. There's a couple different stadia that are mentioned, and depends which one you want to choose, but also the exterior angle of a pentagon in trigonometry we also get now equals, well, now that's again a phi ratio, and we see a phi ratio here in the Great Pyramid also. This is not exactly phi, it's a little bit off, but in the videos that I've made, I go through the actual best survey data, and perfect pi is built into the Great Pyramid. You just have to look from the right side. Each side of a pyramid has a slightly different base length, and that's important to calculating the perfect, or as so close to perfect as to be indistinguishable. And so again, we have Earth, Moon, pi, phi, all that stuff's built into these, and it's all just considered coincidence. Now, the entrance to the pyramid is 56 feet above ground. Now, that's also will tie into this whole idea where the Cremona scale is the Corinthian scale, and I mentioned that link earlier. Well, so 48 feet, the Parthenon, the temple of Olympian Zeus, is 48 Cremona feet. Now, even these, the units and the breakdown, that's just a 1, 2, 3, A, B, C of the harmonic numbers and other connections. Now, I'll go through that in that video series as well, but it's just all there, ties into, like especially 1728, for instance, and 144, built into across the Bible, especially New Jerusalem, but also the much older Epic of Gilgamesh. These are the defining numbers in that very ancient story of the flood and the ark. Now, at 56 feet above ground, well, that's the same height as Temple of Olympian Zeus, but it's also the same height as Sanchi Stupa, which in itself, in that series on the Parthenon, I go into this in some depth. And just again, it's just a 1, 2, 3 ABC of all the lovely harmonic, very important Pythagorean numbers, so important to math, geometry, arithmetic, and astronomy in this quadrivium. And Sanchi Stupa, of course, another connection of the pyramid, a 7:11 ratio we find within the major proportions of there. And then we convert that to Cremona or Corinthian, we get pi over 2, or 20, or 11 over 7, effectively pi over 2. If any engineer can get this close to pi, he's doing very, very well. But also we have, again, from the Cremona, where we get the 22 over 7 ratio of pi. Again, I'm using the ideal measures, 440 cubits on each face. There's a slight variation, and if you look at the pyramid as a 3D object, not the 3,200 two-dimensional view, but a 86,400 three-dimensional view, you'll also get pi to such a high level of precision that it's beyond the reach of engineers still to this day. Now, also the Parthenon, which that's all as well incorporates these proportions of pi, and phi is built into the Great Pyramid. It's built into the things that's in that series as well, just like Sanchi. Now we come to the megalithic yard, and at this point, like Alexander Thom, if you do a first page search, you're going to see it under pseudo metrology and all these things. Again, it's how to describe those. There's a strong resistance to this whole field of measurement amongst, let's call it, official archaeology, which is, for instance, a gentleman who he had some ideas on archaeology. He was trained in the sciences, he had to go and then get an arts degree to be able to present this archaeological evidence. And sadly, archaeology is not really. There are scientific archaeologists, quite a few of them. I'm not going to take it away from it. So many hardworking, brilliant, dedicated people. However, the establishment itself is very resistant to metrology or any sort of even astronomy, even archaeoastronomy, which was long known about. Only in recent years have they admitted to it, and they're still very reluctant to it. But the megalithic yard, I want to well, let's talk about that now. Alexander Thom, like so, he went around studying hundreds of sites across France, Scotland, Ireland, and England, of course. Stonehenge not being just one of them, and he proposed something called this megalithic yard that they were using it now. That measuring, we're talking about survey, and so when you're designing a temple, you have to survey the site. This is before you begin construction. You need to have survey, and that involves measurement of length, but also of angles and orientation. And this is this is by no means new. This is very ancient. And so, for instance, we see there's quite a few of these pictures. It's pretty much a standard in ancient Egypt, was stretching the cord. And so there we see that's from Dendera. So what they're doing is they're surveying the site, and they're marking out the alignments and setting out the basic units as well. And here we see, so it's two poles with a loop of cord stretched out, and then these stakes were hammered in, and that's where we mark the sacred temple precinct and the alignment of these things. So along, this line would be the main axis of the temple. Here are some ancient Egyptian survey and measuring tools to how to construct, how to make the building level, and these are very simple. But with these very simple tools, we get very, very accurate measurements, and this goes a long way to explaining a lot of fluff out there, stuff. But it's there's a lot of evidence in regards to their techniques. It's like literally they wrote it on their walls, but this is just ignored by infomercialists and some, especially one character, BF, who I consider to be an outright fraud. And here, for instance, we see this tool here. We see how it applies there. It's to get a straight walls. We see the plumb and the level. On the level, this is a square house. This is another tool, the grommer, which was used to create very, very accurate survey techniques. Now, the Romans used the same method. It's been found, examples of it. Now, they were able to construct aqueducts over 100 kilometers long, which maintained a perfect angle, ever so slight, just so that the water would run downhill. If there was even a bit of a kink, the water would pool up and run off the side. But they were able to create these aqueducts that ran straight for over 100 kilometers. And incidentally, if you add up the weight of all the stone and the work that's put into these things, add it up all together, get the weight, and this firstly, the survey is equal to the Great Pyramid, but also the scale of the work is equal to the Great Pyramid, or the pyramids as a whole, as a matter of fact. The ancient Greeks and Romans were masters of engineering and survey. However, because records survive, again, there's a certain narrative among certain people, this lost high technology fluff, and they never will talk about these things or investigate. They will keep diminishing Roman and Greek abilities because it destroys the narrative, because it's bunk. Unfortunately, now I know there are people who appreciate sort of what I do, but also I have to say, it is bunk. It's like, why doesn't BF ever look into the Greek or the Roman stuff and do an analysis of that? Because the records are there, the technology was there. It's very simple tools, very simple techniques, and this is just some of it's shameful. Sorry, it's just friggin' shameful. So you'll also find lots of examples of like graves. So the engineers, surveyors of the Roman period were held in some high esteem, and there we see the grommer. So there you can see the four pieces, and even like the rope and the coil and units of measurement, which was so important. So not just getting the right angle, but also marking out to sacred. So whether it was roads, aqueducts, temples, palaces, it was very important, and they were very skilled at doing these things. And it's there are records for it. The temples, the aqueducts, they still exist. It's not in dispute at all, but it is ignored by some. Surveyor, humour, and so survey was also important. But this is these ancient, very simple tools, just like with stoneworking, has been passed down to us, and is never the so-called ancient lost high technology. There are some very interesting pieces that are unexplained. I won't dance around that. But the bulk of it, which is described as lost ancient high technology, is not lost. It is not high technology. It's high knowledge, and it's been passed down now through the wisdom of Thoth and Hermes and Mercury, gods of knowledge, gods of science, gods of weights and measures. Another example of this are these Herma or Herm stones. You'll find, like, all right, but they're connected to the cult of Hermes, and they were used to define sacred precincts. So again, marking out the temple territory, and then the temples themselves, a very important feature throughout the ancient world. Herma, like, it comes from Hermaphroditus, Ditos, which was the daughter of Venus and Aphrodite, and was, well, a hermaphrodite. So that's where we get the herm stones, or hermaphrodite comes from there. And you can also see it passed on through later esoteric, especially alchemical connections, but you also notice that this alchemy also incorporates astronomy as well as the compass and the square. The same things have just been passed on throughout time. We see the fourth, it's all this geometry, astronomy, arithmetic, and music has been passed on, and like the tools and the methods, never lost. It's never been lost. It's part of a tradition. Even the paintings on the wall, again, something which some people don't want to cover, because it shows actually the tools and the methods that they used. Now this is carpentry, but there's also examples of them moving large stones and things like that. And it's like that they carved it and they painted it, and it's still there, but it's looked over, or when they do show it, they dismiss it as some sort of I assume some ancient conspiracy to bamboozle people in the future. I don't know. But so the craft guilds, great cathedral builders, and for instance, they were using exactly the same to the compass, the square, and the level. It's all there. It's never was lost. It's been passed on throughout time, and we even still see it again, just like with Doric and Ionic. We see that these tools and this stonework and the legends connected to it, and the tools and the methods and the measuring tools, it's been passed on. It's still around with us, for instance, in the Freemasonic tradition, which, like, now you have free and accepted Masons, but the original, before that, a Mason, you had to be an architect or a Mason or someone involved in the trade to be a member. That's from the Craft Guild period. And of course, just as Doric and Ionic and Corinthian, as I mentioned earlier. Now we're going to go have a look. So we've established some of the stuff that's going on here, and now Alexander Thom and the Megalithic yard. Previous video, could be part 11 or 12, the Chrysono Cromlech in Karnak, the 3-4-5 triangle. Egyptian surveyors used the 3-4-5 triangle to mark their land borders and to measure land, especially when the flood come. If you lost a percentage of your land, your taxes would be adjusted, because your tax rates were set on the amount of land, and if you lost land to the river, they would adjust it, and this is one of the tools they would use to measure it and to remark borders as well between land when the flood come along and would knock out the stakes. Of course, Pythagorean theorem, 3a squared plus b squared equals c squared. It's also shown in it's hidden in the King's Chamber. Again, another very important part, still passed on through Euclid's Elements. This is all important ancient textbook on geometry, and still, again, very important part of Freemasons, which emerged from the craft guilds in this particular set of knowledge. Now, the megalithic yard. Okay, so I'll put the link to the Chrysono, because there's links in there as well to these papers and stuff. And what we have is Alexander Thom 40 by 30 megalithic yards. Now, there are variations on what exactly a megalithic yard is, and well, I'm proposing that it's 2.7222222 feet, and the difference between that and the most commonly referenced one is the length of, the width, actually less than the width of a hair. But that's still important because now when we come back to Cremona and the feet, and the so-called modern English foot, as well as Doric and Ionic, what we have is a harmony point once again, or a unity point between multiple sets of ancient units of measure, but also at very important points. So for instance, I went through some of the importance in regards to these numbers. Here's a couple of diagrams on the net. So we see the megalithic yard 2.720 and 2 points, so just a fraction from 2.722 or 2.72 feet. And again, we're talking very narrow margins, so I've just highlighted the different other people have investigated it and looked into it and proposed these different measures, how they emerge from this geometry. And well, back to the Doric and the Ionic, I mentioned how it's we have a unity point, like a whole number point, but also the Cremona scale and the importance of this particular set of numbers, and that again, that there's evidence, I do believe, quite a bit of evidence around the world to suggest that the Corinthian foot was or it became the Cremona scale. But I believe, at least at Greek times, I do, and of course because it corresponds to the ancient Indian, the Indian architecture of the same period, and we see, like for instance, earlier episodes, 108 feet, 108 symbolically being so important to Hindus, Buddhists and Jains, but literally their temples are built at 108 feet, still to this day, of course, part of this ancient legacy, and why there are a certain specific set of units of measure that were used by ancient peoples. And the chicken or the egg is exactly this. It's hard to say which one come first, or possibly they all existed earlier. That's a very long, complicated subject with no definitive answer, at least that I can't provide. But let's keep going. So now the megalithic yard. Why do I say it's 2.7222222 feet? Less than the width of a hair from the standard versions, because that creates 36 megalithic yards exactly. So from 98. Now I'm going to do some more later, because they're like at 97.994. There's also this correspondence, and again we're talking like such narrow splitting hairs literally. But we have some interesting stuff that'll be for a future episode, just as a follow-up to examine this a little bit more. But why again is 36 so important? Now in previous episode, let me pause a moment. Okay, so keeping 36 in mind, we have the Alistena, or the Ailstones, his stone ship, and of course it connects to earlier again, just the same thing where we have multiple sets of ancient units of measure coming together, Indus, Sumerian, and well, also the Egyptian royal cubit. And of course there's a lot of it's just all in there. It's always coming back to these very important great pyramid proportions. I mentioned the importance of grains for both weights and measure. And again, Doric and Ionic, same, always the same. But at now the width of it, where we had again the Egyptian royal cubit, and how that seems to have been pointing up, but that 36 Egyptian royal cubits, the width, that being the point of that little pause there. And so we come back to 36 megalithic yards. The tetractys, or triangular numbers, this is very Pythagorean. We have 36 in arithmetic just being so beautiful across 3 dimensions because of its connection to the 36 is 6 squared. 6 is the most perfect of the perfect numbers. But also 36, so in the Yugas, 3600 divine years, 3600 seconds per hour, going again back to the Babylonians and Sumerians in the base 60 number system, where 60 hours sorry, 60 minutes per hour, 60 seconds per week. This is a legacy of their particular knowledge. So both the clock and the compass, 360 degrees compass. The exact date is argued about, but we see evidence for it, which will probably again push this back much further. Also, it's again we're getting defines a moon by the long foot. Now, the long foot of 1.056 feet was the Persian foot, but also again evidence for it to be found in Stonehenge Phase 1, going again way back in time as an ancient unit, but the Mayans as well. So the 360 days. Now, you might have seen it said that the ancients, such as the Romans and Mayans, had a 360-day year. That's not true. They had a 365. Actually, the Mayans had a 365 and 1/4 year. Actually, just as exact as our system. But what they also had was a 5-day. So they had 12 months. Well, actually, they divided different. But just to keep it simple, the Romans, for instance, had 12 months. 30 days times 12 is 360. Then they had a 13th month of 5 days. Well, the Mayans and around that part of the world, they had a similar theme going on. So they had 360 days plus 5, which was this. And interesting that they both considered it a very unlucky time to begin a new project. So during that 5-day 13th month, just like the 13th sign of the zodiac, Facius, well, we have this corresponding in there, and again, crossing time, crossing cultures. And so, yeah, 360 days was never a thing. The Egyptians knew about 365 days, the Mayans knew about 365 days, and the Romans learned it from the Egyptians as well. So it was not the case that there was ever a 360-day year. But 36 again, so being very important in through the grain, establishing and grains to create a ruler, also to create weights. So it's a nice tie-in. It's also worth remembering the Treta Yuga 3600 divine years, or in our years, that's 1,296,000, which is, again, corresponds to the number of seconds in a compass. 360 degrees times 60 minutes times 60 seconds gives us that exact number. And the yugas are just overloaded with this information. And of course, 1296 being 6 to the 4th, 6 times 6 times 6 times 6, or 6 in the 4th dimension, as opposed to the importance of 36, especially in the 3rd and 2nd. Also in the, how that connects. Again, just lovely, lovely stuff. Also, of course, 36, just whether it's 2D geometry, 3D geometry, of course, it's a 60 degrees being the vesica, the rhombus inside, which is 3600 minutes. Cosine, trigonometry, again, we get... we saw that earlier again, how that connect again. Just 252 was a phi ratio, and 36 degrees also brings us back to the golden number, the divine proportion, or phi. And the exact number of how the megalithic yard was divided up. Now, firstly, did it actually exist? Well, it's disputed. However, it just so happens that it does correspond to this. So perhaps the ancients in Karnak and in France and in England and Scotland were actually using, again, the English, so-called modern English foot, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, Cremona. Possibly they were using that back in the time, or the megalithic was, again, that all these units were emerged from a single earlier unit, which would suggest again that there was one single earlier culture, and even though they appear different, they do come together at these very important points. Okay, and next part. Now, in other videos, other series, I've pointed out the importance of certain numbers. Now, this would be 36 megalithic yard, 98 feet at this ratio, 2.7222222 feet, which again is less than a hair from the most of the numbers given. However, so we also went through 36, but like 24, 48, 108, 144, 432, 1296. These are also very important numbers, and so we begin with 24. So the Dapara Yuga, 86,400 years, which is the diameter of a sun in miles, coincidentally, 2,400 divine years. Again, it's one of these lovely numbers, the detractors. So if we add them together, we get 10. 1, 2, 3, 4. I mentioned that earlier. But we also, if we multiply them, we get 24. It's a nice description of perigee. So the minimum distance between the sun, the Earth and the Moon, 1 AU astronomical unit, is the average distance from Earth to the Sun. 240 degrees defines the outside angle of a hexagon, and in this case, this particular angle of a vesica. Once more, 24 letters in the Greek alphabet, 24 knuckles, and even this ancient counting system, the long scale, 24. 2,400,000 long rods defines the diameter of the Earth, and 24 hours per day. 48 again, so the Satya Yuga, 1728, so important, but also it's 4,800 years. Buddha, 48 days under the Bodhi tree, both in New Jerusalem, as well as the Ark of Utnapishtim, the original flood story from the Epic of Gilgamesh, both them being very important numbers across multiple forms, and even troy ounce. So when you see the price of gold or silver, precious metals, it's at 31.104 grams, and itself is a harmonic number, but it's 480 grains. Even in Bode's law, for instance, that 48 would be the important number to define. So a 48-pointed star, half of that 24, half of that 12, and the 6-pointed star have that same vesica geometry which emerges from the hexagon. Also connects to these points. Now, 108, it's just everywhere. It's so important, whether it's in 108 feet in all these ancient structures, whether it's in 108 in symbolism, just across cultures, across the world. It's just everywhere. It's built into our measurement systems. It's ancient measurement systems was just like a fundamental. You cannot, even still to this day, in even screen resolution radios, and especially here in Australia, it's just pretty much one of the most awesomest numbers there is in, if you want, for astronomy. I actually sort of posted some of his info on an astronomy site where people just post pictures of Hubble pictures, and somehow that's considered astronomy. I pointed this stuff out, the proportions and the speeds, and I got banned from there for some reason. Again, there's this thing amongst, what's amongst so-called science communities, what they consider to be science. It's pretty gifts, unfortunately, and it's not different from a lot of other fluffy stuff. But again, in Buddhism, in the original tradition, in the measurements of the temples and the symbols on his feet, how many bells are rung, 108. Jains, Hindus, Buddhists, it's just like the number. Of course, measurement systems, still now going back. In geometry, again, just one of these things: arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, even in pentatonic musical scales, you'll find it. But whether it's New Jerusalem, I need to check that one. Okay, but 108, Epic of Gilgamesh, and New Jerusalem, it's just there. This is what the cube symbolism is. The pentagram, golden ratio, again, 108 degrees, just it's so important. Again, beautiful number in arithmetic as well. 144, so just a reminder, we had 24, 48, 108, 144. Again, sun, moon, earth, 1440 minutes per day. Ancient systems of measuring weight, screen resolution, and especially here in Australia, even the radio frequencies. In geometry, 144. So yeah, all of these very, they're all here, always repeated. The Fibonacci sequence, 144 is 12 squared. It's also a 12th Fibonacci number across dimensions, 144 or 1440. This fourth dimensional number, very important. That's what's underlying a lot of this. Like I did a different. If you look at binomial theorem slightly different and do it as this 4D grid, what you get is all the beautiful numbers. Like for instance, 108. For instance, this is up to the fourth dimension, and just some really lovely stuff. You can't make it up. It's maths, it's geometry, it's built into the proportions. The Mayan calendar, 144,000 for the Baktun. Even that's the same as the Satya Yuga, 1728, which divides back down into the entry
the middle period and the exit period of the Yuga. It's not a strict line. There is like a transition. Again, that's 144. New Jerusalem, 144. Octahedron, again, two-dimensional, three-dimensional geometry. And even if you add the 5 platonic solids together, what do you get? 144. Rosicrucians, once more, they said 144 elements, 144 octaves, music and alchemy. Epic of Gilgamesh again. 432, same thing. Defining number for the Ark of Utnapishtim, Epic of Gilgamesh. Same thing for the New Jerusalem, weights and measures, ancient systems. A 432 hertz. The Vesica, once more. The cycle of the grand total of the Yugas, 432. The Kali Yuga itself, 43,200. Also the diameter of the Earth in the long scale. Also the diameter of the Sun in the long scale. The radius of the Sun would be 43,200 miles. 1296, again, same thing. We see this harmonized Sun and Moon, the compass I mentioned earlier, even the apothecary's weight. Just so happens that, again, it's one of these conversions to metric. So again, metric's not new. Metric's very old. Tetra Yuga, 1296. Also a very important number in regards to Platonic understanding of and Platonic philosophy. And so this is what we have. It's it's not just the unity point. That's why I think that this is the megalithic yard. Now I will examine the other versions of it, because there is something else lingering in there. And again, we're splitting hairs, but if you do split the hair, you'll actually get some lovely stuff as well, which would also harmonize with the Ionic and Doric, the Ionic as well. However, you would lose the harmonies with the modern foot and the Cremona scale, but that'll be for the next episode. But so all these structures around the world that were 98 feet, which was focused on, and we'll just revise them. So ancient sites, beginning with Megalithic, across France, across England, up through into Scotland. Now even so, for instance, Stony Littleton Long Barrow, 98. And 49 feet wide, so that's 1/2 of that, and this would essentially got the same thing going on there at 98 feet. Stand and Drew, Castlereagh Stones, Wasbister Barrow, again 49 and 98 feet. This is clearly a pattern that's going on now. The sun wheel or the medicine wheel in Alberta, Canada, very, very old, as what's the most often referred to date. We find it in Mayan and Peruvian. Down into Brazil, there's the stone circle there, astronomically aligned. Like all these things, they've got the same important measures, astronomical alignments, which again connects to all these other features, even to the beautiful temples there in India, not just one, but two, including the Ellora Caves. Now, that is 164 feet long, and by most references, 108 feet wide as well. And Ain Dara, well, ancient Egypt, in several sites in ancient Egypt and even the later Roman period where they rebuilt these temples. Now I mentioned 82 feet, so again we're seeing 41 feet, half of that. And these are the 21, 41, 11, even 12. These are like literally the dimensions of modern esoteric architecture, places like the US Capitol Building, Supreme Court Building, White House, the major memorials along Washington, but you also find it in the similar cities, Canberra, Brasilia, and Astana, Paris, in the sacred architecture of London, of the great cathedrals. It's just, this is literally the measurements, and of course, okay, Trajan's column. So what we have is part of it. Now, either you believe in coincidence, or there was actual geometry, arithmetic, astronomy that was passed on. And well, the astronomy is in no doubt. They'll align. Alignment's part of his thing. The ancient survey techniques from the Egyptians and even the ancient Indians have described similar ways of setting up their temple alignments and plans using very simple tools, very simple tools, able to achieve a high level of precision. Again, throughout the ages, even like, for instance, great cathedrals were done with a level of excellence, which again, just like the Roman aqueducts, again, it's all encoded in these legends and traditions, and unfortunately, there's a stream of internet David Icke type of stuff that would just say, oh, this is demonic, satanic, or whatever. It's actually keeping you. It's actually, that is poison. That is snake oil. It's keeping people in ignorance. They talk about opening and enlightening people. They're doing the exact opposite. They are a poison. They are a cancer, and there's nothing nice to say about it. Like they say, you should at least find something nice to say. Well, the only thing nice to say is that hopefully one day it's going to be die out, and that's the only nice thing I got to say for it. And possibly that maybe they will learn. There's still a chance for them to learn and open their minds and to be enlightened and awoke, as they say. And so these are measurable, testable, repeatable across time, across cultures. I don't know how many hours I've done on how many sites across the world, ancient and modern, the systems, the legends, the stories connected to these things. It's just all part of this unified, harmonized system that just repeated over and over again, cross time, cross cultures, across the world. Coincidence can be completely excluded from this. That is a pathology to protect the narrative. And well, best of luck to you, But what we have, also I'll do another feature on how conversion rates, such as the 6 to 7 ratio, which appears elsewhere. There are also these very important conversion rates between the Doric, the Ionic, Samian, the Minoan, and other units of measure, including the Royal Babylonian and the Egyptian Royal Cubit. They appear to be different, but they are actually, even when they are different, they're at a very small number of certain fixed ratios, such as 15 to 16 and 24 to 25, which are also very important in music theory still to this day. Music, geometry, arithmetic, and astronomy, the unified quadrivium. It's the way to go. It's can be measured, can be tested. It's going back. We need to look again and revise our understanding of the past, and with that, hopefully, to relearn some of the brilliant techniques that they had able to achieve amazing things with simple tools, but with amazing knowledge. And that's the power of a human. We have amazing capabilities. However, this modern thread, which is like a tumor going across, will diminish this. It will diminish you, and it will say that this can't be done. Well, it can be done. It was done. The records still exist. The harmony between the measurable, the testable, the observable is still there. The modern scientific findings are actually, are backing this up. Concepts such as Bode's law is now re-emerging, the importance of the golden ratio, and these types of things, which were embedded in these ancient sites, in these ancient numbers, in these ancient stories. Either the global society is much older than what the history books are, or there was an earlier civilization which spread this across. Now, either way, it's pretty much really irrelevant what happened first. They might be forever lost in the depths of time. However, from the periods and the structures and the stories which have been left to us, which have been passed on, there is clearly something very profound, something very important going on. And you don't need to, I won't play nice with frauds, and that's the simple thing, and that's all there is to say about it. I won't play nice with them. And with that, anyway, hope you enjoyed. Hope you had a good one, and cheerio. And there is a lot more to come. This is really just the tip of the iceberg, as I keep saying.